They said the bell was forged from iron taken from a battlefield, where no prayer could cleanse the ground. When it rang, children vanished into the night. When it was silent, priests claimed to hear voices in their sleep. For generations, no one touched it. But once someone did, and what followed has never left the village. The fields of the valley were quiet that winter. Snow covered the ground in a sheet so white, it seemed to erase the memory of what lay beneath. The camera would linger there, drifting slowly across the frost, until it found the forge. The forge was small, a hut of stone and soot, crouched against the wind. Inside, men worked with iron that was darker than iron should be. It gleamed without light. It seemed to resist the hammer, then bend too easily under its weight. They said the metal came from a field of war, a place where bones were still buried shallow, where the ground refused to grow grass. The blacksmiths had dug there for weeks, bringing up chunks of ore mixed with fragments of rusted blades. Villagers whispered it should have been left untouched, but the church had ordered otherwise. The priest spoke of a bell, a great bell that would call the faithful and sanctify the valley. He said the iron was a gift of providence, a chance to bind heaven to earth. But when the first sparks flew from the forge, one of the smiths looked away. The fire hissed in a way fire should not hiss, like water poured on coals, like breath drawn through teeth. The men told no one. They kept their heads down and worked day after day, night after night. They hammer, anvil, hammer again. The sound echoed across the valley, reaching homes where children stirred uneasily in their beds. Even in sleep, they would cover their ears. By the third week, the iron no longer felt like iron. When lifted, it seemed lighter than stone, yet heavier than it should be. It rang faintly when struck, not a clear note, but something low, something hidden. The younger smith grew pale and stopped speaking. He was found outside one morning, staring at the church with ash-black hands. He left the village that night and was never seen again. The bell began to take shape. Its surface was darker than pitch, as though no polish could brighten it. The priest ordered them to carve Latin verses around its crown. Salvator Mundi, save the world. But the letters warped as the chisel struck. Lines bent inward, twisting into patterns that were difficult to read. And yet, the priest blessed it. He said it was holy. The day came when the bell was complete. It sat in the forge like a giant skull, silent, waiting. Villagers gathered outside to watch, their breath rising in the cold air. Children were held close, their eyes fixed on the dark curve of metal. The priest raised his hand, and for the first time, the bell was struck. The sound tore through the valley, not a clear toll, not the song of a bell, but a roar, a groan, a note, so low it seemed to move through bone instead of air. The snow shifted on rooftops, windows cracked, crows fell silent in the trees. And then came the storm. From a cloudless sky, the wind rose. It swept through the village with no warning, carrying with it the smell of iron and smoke. Shutters slammed shut. Animals screamed in their stalls. The forge fire blew out in an instant, plunging the hut into darkness. The priest stood firm. He said this was a sign, proof of God's power, but the villagers only looked at the sky. The snow was falling now, though none had seen a cloud. It came heavy, relentless, covering the footprints at their feet. Later that night, men swore they heard the bell ring again. No one had touched it. It tolled once, low and long, as if the valley itself exhaled. And in the morning, the fields were drowned in white. The tracks of the smiths, who had walked home the evening before, were gone, and one of them, one who had labored longest at the anvil, never reached his house. His wife found the door still open, his boots missing. The snow around the forge swept smooth as water. The priest said nothing. He ordered the bell moved to the tower, and the people obeyed. But the whispers began that night. Some said the bell was not forged by hands alone. Some said the iron had brought with it voices that no prayer could silence, and others swore that when the wind carried just right, you could still hear the sound of hammers striking again and again. Long after the forge had gone cold, the valley had a bell now, and it would never know silence again. The church stood on the hill, as though the earth itself had tried to push it away. Stone walls leaned inward, cracked by rain and frost. Its roof sagged under the weight of years. Paint peeled from the doors, leaving pale wood exposed like bone. The villagers climbed the hill every Sunday, trudging through snow or mud, carrying their children close. Inside, the pews smelled of mildew, candles guttered in the drafts that slipped through broken windows. The choir loft had long since collapsed, leaving only a scar of beams across the rear wall. But still, the priest stood at the altar. He spoke of salvation. He spoke of strength. And most of all, he spoke of a bell. He told them the church could not survive without it, that a holy sound would bind the people together, that God's voice must be heard across the valley. He said the silence was killing them. The villagers lowered their heads, not daring to object. But the older ones remembered. They remembered where the iron had come from. Not just a battlefield, not just rusted weapons dug from the ground, but graves, unmarked graves, left behind after plague and war. The metal had been taken from earth that had not been blessed, iron pulled from soil that had swallowed flesh. At night, some whispered this to their children, that the bell was not holy, that the church was building a mouth for the dead. But in daylight, no one spoke. The priest was not a cruel man, but his certainty was unshakable. He said that doubt was the work of Satan, that questioning the bell was questioning God. And when an old woman raised her voice, saying she had seen the ground bleed when the ore was dug, he silenced her with one word: blasphemy. And she never spoke of it again. The bell was brought into the church before it was hung. It rested on wooden beams before the altar, dark and massive, its surface dull in the candlelight. The villagers filed past it during Mass, some crossing themselves, others averting their eyes. Children reached out to touch it, only to be pulled back by trembling hands. One man swore the metal was cold, colder than stone, colder than ice. So cold that it burned his fingertips. He left the church that day with his hand wrapped in cloth. The priest preached louder than ever. He said the bell would protect them, that no storm would harm their homes, that no illness would enter their village again, that the faithful would be safe, so long as the bell rang, and the people wanted to believe him. They needed to. Winters had been cruel, children had been lost, the fields yielded less each year. Faith was all they had left, but something wasn't right. During evening prayer, villagers heard faint vibrations, like a hum, that seemed to come from nowhere. Candles flickered, though no wind moved through the room. And when the priest spoke, his words seemed to echo faintly before the bell itself, as if the iron was answering him. One boy said he heard voices in the ringing silence. He told his mother that the bell was whispering. She struck him for lying. But afterward, she too avoided walking past it. The tower was repaired to hold its weight. Stone blocks were lifted into place, wooden scaffolding creaking under the strain. At night, men working on the site would leave early, swearing they heard footsteps above them. But each morning, the priest was there, smiling, his hands folded, urging them to continue. When the day came, the bell was raised, ropes strained, pulleys groaned. The villagers stood below, silent, their faces pale as the massive shape rose into the tower. The priest lifted his hands. He declared the bell holy. He told them it would carry their prayers to heaven. And when the first rope was cut, the sound echoed through the valley. But it was not yet the bell that rang. It was the creak of wood, the groan of stone, the weight of something too heavy for the earth to bear. One man collapsed. His heart gave out before the bell was even struck. He died with his eyes open, staring at the tower.
The priest ordered him buried before sunset, and he spoke no word of it at Mass. From that day, the church was different. The silence inside felt heavier. Prayers seemed to hang in the air. Even the choir, when they sang, sounded muted, as though the building was waiting for a sound that had not yet been made. The villagers obeyed their priest. They attended Mass. They offered prayers, but their eyes were drawn again and again to the tower, to the black iron that waited above them, and they wondered, though no one dared to ask aloud, what would happen when the bell was struck. The night was still. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops, softening every sound. The streets of the village were dark, the lanterns long extinguished, and above them, the church tower waited. For weeks the bell had hung in silence. The villagers had passed beneath it, with bowed heads, hearing nothing but the creak of ropes and the groan of stone. It had become part of the sky itself, dark, immovable, suspended like a threat no one dared name. But tonight, it would ring. The priest had chosen midnight. He said that Christ himself had been betrayed in the dark hours, and that the bell would banish shadow with sacred sound. He called it a victory over silence. He called it divine. The villagers gathered, shuffling into pews with pale faces and stiff hands. Children were carried half asleep, their heads resting on their mothers' shoulders. The air smelled of wax and damp wood. The candles flickered, casting restless shadows against the stone.
Above them, the bell waited. The priest raised his arms. His voice was steady. He spoke of salvation. He said the bell would be the voice of heaven. And then with a single nod, he gave the order. The rope was pulled. The first toll shook the church. It rolled through the valley like thunder, vibrating through walls, through glass, through bone. The note was too low, too heavy. It lingered in the air, as if refusing to end. Windows cracked in their frames. Dust fell from the rafters. Candles bent sideways, though no wind touched them, didn't tame the screams. Not from the people, from the animals. Cows bellowed in their stalls. Dogs howled as though their legs were being broken. Horses reared and tore at their reins, until the leather snapped. Even the crows in the trees outside shrieked and flew into the night. The bell tolled again. This time, it was not only sound. The villagers felt it in their teeth, in their skulls, in the deep hollow of their chests. It was as if the iron had entered them, vibrating in the spaces where silence once lived. Mothers clutched their children tighter, but something wasn't right. The children were awake now, their eyes wide, their lips trembling, and one by one they began to speak, not in cries, not in the tongue of their families, but in Latin, words they had never been taught, phrases older than the church itself. Too, they whispered them with eyes unfocused, their voices weaving together into something too precise to be coincidence. One boy stood on the pew. His voice rose louder than the rest. Ite clamavant omnes una voce, and all cried out with one voice. The congregation froze. Mothers covered their children's mouths, but the words forced their way out, soft and relentless, too. The sound filled the church, mingling with the toll of the bell. It became impossible to tell where the children ended and the iron began. Then that's when he heard it. An old man at the back, half deaf from years of labor, swore he heard another voice. Not the children, not the bell, something else. A tone layered beneath the sound, deeper, like a whisper forced through stone. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, tears streaming down his face. The priest did not falter. He spread his arms wide, proclaiming that this was proof that God was here among them, that the children were chosen to speak his tongue. He shouted over the chaos, his voice breaking with zeal, "This is the presence of the Lord." But many were not convinced. Some turned toward the door, only to find it barred from within. The priest had ordered it locked before the mass began. No one would leave until the bell had finished. The rope was pulled again. A third toll thundered through the valley. Glass shattered in the windows. Stone cracked along the walls. Children wailed in Latin until their voices gave out, collapsing limp against their mother's arms. Silence followed, but it was not peace. It was the silence after a wound, the silence that waits before the blood begins to flow. The priest wiped his brow, his face glowing with triumph. He declared the bell consecrated. He said their village had been chosen, their faith rewarded. He told them they would never fear darkness again. But the villagers looked at their children, at their lips still moving soundlessly, as though repeating words even in sleep, at their eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, as though they still saw something no one else could see. The bell had rung, the sound had passed, but its weight lingered in the air, pressing against every chest, and for the first time, the people began to wonder, what if it was not God who had answered? Snow lay heavy on the rooftops. It gathered in the corners of windowsills, pressed against doors, muffled every step. The village looked peaceful from a distance, silent, undisturbed, but inside the homes, no one slept soundly. Since the night of the first toll, the children had changed. They woke in the dark hours, sitting upright in bed with their eyes wide open. They whispered to themselves in languages their parents did not know. Some laughed softly at nothing. Others walked barefoot across the frozen floors, pressing their ears against the walls, as though listening for something no one else could hear. Parents told themselves it was nothing, just the imagination of youth, a passing fever. The priest assured them it was a blessing, a sign of God's mark upon the young. He said their children had been chosen to hear what adults could not, but something wasn't right. Weeks passed, the nights grew colder, and the footprints began to appear. The first were found outside a cottage near the river. A mother rose before dawn to fetch water. When she opened her door, she saw them, small prints pressed deep into the snow, leading away from her house, bare feet. The steps curved toward the church, steady and deliberate, but they ended at the tower. There were no returning tracks, and no child in her bed. Her daughter was gone. The villagers searched through the morning. They combed the woods, broke the ice along the river, climbed the frozen hills. There was no body, no trace, only the prints, and the tower above them, silent in the light of day. The priest told them to pray. He said the child had been taken into God's keeping, that they must not doubt, that the bell had called her for a purpose they could not yet understand. But the mother refused to be silent. She cried in the square. She said she had heard her daughter's voice the night before, whispering to someone unseen. She said she had pulled her from bed twice, only to find her standing at the door again, moments later. And she said that when she pressed her ear against her daughter's chest, she thought she heard something. Not a heartbeat, not breath, but a vibration, like the faint echo of a bell. Others began to listen, and soon more prints appeared. One boy vanished after midnight, his brother swearing he had risen calmly, put on his coat, and walked out the door. Another girl was taken from the loft above her parents, climbing down the ladder without sound, her eyes fixed on the window. A third child was found wandering the street in the dark, whispering, "I hear it, I hear it," before slipping away into the night. Each time the trail ended the same, at the base of the tower, at the steps that led to the door, where the bell hung, but no further. And when fathers tried to break the door open, they found it locked, bolted from the inside. The priest refused the key. He said the children were not lost. They had been chosen, that their souls were safe within the tower, in the presence of the sacred bell. He told them not to mourn, not to question, not to speak of it again. But the village could not forget. At night, parents kept their children close, tying them into their beds with rope, stacking wood against the doors. Some stayed awake until dawn, watching, listening.
and still they were taken. Somehow, silently, the children slipped away, and always their footprints led to the tower. One man swore he heard them. He had been awake when his son rose. The boy walked to the door, as though in a dream, smiling faintly. The father followed him into the snow, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched his son walk ahead of him, barefoot in the drifts, leaving no sign of pain. And then just before the tower, the boy stopped. He turned his head, and that's when the father heard it. A sound so low it was almost silence, a vibration under the snow, a faint toll that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The boy smiled, reached out his hand, and vanished. The father collapsed in the snow, clutching only air. When he told the priest, he was silenced. When he told the village, he was warned. And when he told no one else, he still could not forget. The tower remained locked. The bell did not ring again. But each night, more children were lost. The mothers wept quietly in their homes. The fathers stood in silence with empty eyes. And the snow outside carried only footprints that ended where the stone began. The priest said nothing more. He stood at the altar each Sunday, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering, and the people listened, because there was nothing else they could do. But the silence in the church was heavier now. The air pressed down on their lungs, and the parents who still had children held them tighter, praying they would not hear the sound, because those who had answered the bell never returned. The morning broke gray. The light spread slowly across the frozen fields, dim and hesitant, as though the sun itself wished not to touch the village. Frost clung to every window, smoke hung in the air like a veil, and in that silence a child returned. He was found near the steps of the church, shoeless, his nightshirt stiff with ice, his lips blue. He walked unsteadily, as if each step carried a weight far heavier than his body. His eyes were wide, his skin pale, and though his chest rose and fell, no sound came from him. The villagers gathered in disbelief. For weeks they had only seen children leave, never come back. Mothers reached for him, but he shrank away, clutching his arms around himself. He moved with hesitation, as though he feared being touched. When someone tried to ask him where he had been, he only mouthed the words, unable to force breath behind them. A whisper, so faint it died in the cold. But something wasn't right. The priest was the one who led him inside. He placed a cloak over the boy's shoulders and guided him toward the dark wooden booth of the confessional. The crowd watched in silence as the door closed, and there, behind the lattice, the boy spoke. At first it was only fragments, halting, disjointed, the voice of someone who had seen something they could not name. He said he had heard the bell. He had followed the sound as if pulled by an invisible hand. The snow was cold, yet he felt nothing. His feet carried him without pain, and when he reached the tower, the door had been open. The priest asked what he had seen inside.
And the boy fell silent for a long time. His breath stuttered. The wood creaked beneath his hands. Then, in a voice so low, the priest leaned forward to hear. He said, "They were waiting, not people, not children like him, but figures, standing within the space of the bell itself, shapes without detail, shadows that shifted with the dim light filtering through the cracks." The boy said they did not move, yet he felt them watching. They stood in silence until the bell began to swing, and when it struck, their mouths opened. No words came, only the vibration. The sound pressed against him, through him, as if his body itself was being wrung like the metal above. He tried to cover his ears, but it was inside him. And then they beckoned, their hands lifted slowly, their fingers stretching outward, calling him closer. He felt his body lean forward, though his mind screamed to stop. The sound filled his chest, it filled his throat, and he thought he would burst apart if he did not join them. And that's when he heard it. Not the toll, not the vibration, but words, words that were not his, whispering in his head, not above it, whispers that told him he did not belong in the village anymore, that he had been chosen to stand with them, inside the bell where the sound never ended. The boy began to weep in the booth. He said he had wanted to say yes, that his body had nearly stepped forward, but something pulled him back. A memory, a voice he could not place, someone calling his name, far away, but real. And then the figures closed their mouths. The bell stopped swinging. The tower was dark again, that he was standing outside, barefoot in the snow. The priest asked him who had called him back. The boy shook his head. He did not know, only that it was not the priest, not his parents, not anyone alive. When the booth fell silent, the priest emerged, his face pale. He told the village that the boy had survived a trial of faith, that he had resisted temptation, that they must not fear, that his hands trembled as he spoke. And the boy never raised his voice above a whisper again. He wandered the village with eyes half closed, listening always. If asked what he heard, he would only murmur, "They are waiting," that if pressed further, he would stop speaking entirely. At night he did not sleep. He sat upright in his bed, rocking slowly, his lips moving without sound. His parents said his skin grew colder each day, that his hands shook, as though some unseen rhythm still coursed through them. And though the bell had not rung since that night, the boy swore he still felt it, inside his chest, inside his bones. The villagers tried to believe he was blessed, that his return meant hope, that they could not ignore the way the dogs barked at him when he passed, or the way the other children wept when he came near, the way his shadow sometimes seemed too long against the snow. The priest demanded silence. No one was to repeat what the boy had confessed. It was between him and God. But secrets rot in quiet, and whispers spread faster than fire. Some said the boy had been marked, that his soul was no longer his own, that he had been pulled halfway across the threshold and left stranded between two worlds. Others feared something darker, that the figures inside the bell had let him go, not because he escaped them, but because they wanted him among the living, because through him they could reach the rest. The village did not sleep that winter. The snow pressed higher against the doors, the air froze in their lungs, and every night, parents clutched their children closer, because now they knew the bell did not always take. Sometimes it gave back, and what it returned was never the same. The tower loomed above the village, black against the sky, its spire cut into the pale spring clouds, still rimmed with snow. Birds circled it, but none ever landed on its beams. Inside the church, the curate prayed. He was young, scarcely 30. His hands were raw from fasting, his face hollowed by sleepless nights. That his eyes were steady. He had seen the way the bell swallowed children. He had heard the boys whisper in the confessional, and he had sworn to himself that he would not let it sound again. So he climbed the steps to the tower, each footfall echoing on stone. He carried with him a heavy bar of iron, and when he reached the door, he slid it through the latch. The wood groaned under its weight. The lock held fast. The bell would remain silent. At least, that was what he thought. But something wasn't right. On Easter morning, when the pews were filled and candles lit, the curate stood at the altar beside the priest. The congregation sat hushed, the air thick with incense. The choir's voices rose gently, wavering against the vaulted ceiling, and then it began. At first, just a vibration, subtle. The wooden floor trembled beneath their feet. Chalices rattled faintly on the altar. The curate froze.
The people turned toward the tower, their eyes widened, and then they heard it. The toll deep, iron heavy, pouring down the walls, rolling through their bones. The sound was inside them before it was in their ears. But the tower was locked. The door was barred. No one had entered. Still the bell swung, and with every strike, the candles bent as though caught in a sudden wind. Wax spilled onto the stone. The choir fell silent, their mouths open, but voiceless. The curate's knees buckled. He clutched the altar rail, his body racked by invisible force. The sound pressed into his chest. It climbed into his skull. It was not simply heard. It was felt as if it was shaping him from the inside. And that's when he collapsed. His body struck the stone floor, arms outstretched as if in crucifixion. The congregation gasped. Some fell to their knees, crossing themselves. Others covered their ears, though it did nothing. The bell rang 7 times. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse, breathless, waiting. The curate stirred. His lips moved, but no sound came. When he was lifted from the ground, his eyes darted wildly. He shook his head, over and over, his hands clawing at his ears. But he could no longer hear. He was alive, but deaf, and yet not untouched. Later, when they carried him to his chamber, they found his journals, dozens of them, filled not with words but drawings, faces. Each page held one, twisted, distorted, mouths open in impossible angles, as though caught mid-scream. Some were human, others, less so, crowded together, eyes staring outward as if peering through the page itself. The curate had drawn them with obsessive repetition, the same faces, again and again, and beneath a few, in shaky letters, he had written only one phrase: "They stand in the sound." The villagers whispered that he had seen what the boy had seen, that in the tolling of the iron, he had glimpsed the figures waiting within, and that the cost of defiance was not death, but being left alive, cut off from every voice but theirs. The priest told the people that it was a test, that Easter had revealed the strength of their faith, that the curate's silence was holy. But those who looked at the journals, those who saw the faces scratched in frantic black lines, they knew he had not fallen silent. He was listening still, and somewhere beyond the tower's locked door, the bell was waiting for the next to answer. Perfect. I'll now deliver chapter 7. Silence, ordered by Rome, expanded to its full intended length, approximately 3,000 words, in the calm, documentary, psychologically disturbing voice of Liturgy of Fear. Here is the complete script segment. The road into the village stretched across fields that no longer bore grain. Where wheat once swayed, only brittle stalks remained, bent by wind, broken by frost. Smoke lifted in thin lines from cottages, but doors stayed closed, windows shuttered, children pulled away from view. It was not a place eager for visitors, but Rome had sent them anyway. In spring, when the mud was deep, and the air still bit with cold, the investigators arrived. They came not as pilgrims, nor as rescuers, but as judges, men in cassocks, their hems clean despite the mire, boots polished, books bound in black leather, carried in satchels against their sides. Each wore a crucifix that glinted in the morning light, silver and sharp against the muted land. The villagers watched from their thresholds as the riders passed. Mothers held their children back by the shoulders, whispering them indoors. Men stood with their caps in hand, their eyes lowered, though not from reverence, not from trust. The men of Rome did not smile. They did not greet. They came with faces pale and thin, mouths tight, and eyes that seemed to look not at the people but through them. At the end of the road, the church waited. Its tower cut a black figure into the sky. The iron cross at its peak leaned slightly, as though under a weight unseen, and the door to the tower remained locked, bolted from within, untouched for months. The investigators dismounted. They entered without hesitation. Their boots echoed on the nave's stone floor, each step steady, unbroken. The villagers followed behind in silence, filling the pews like shadows. Their breath hung in the cold air, their hands folded tightly in their laps. The men from Rome studied the space with deliberate care. They traced their fingers across the altar. They pressed palms against the walls, feeling for hidden seams. One held a small mirror to catch the light, examining corners for dust or signs of tampering. Another tapped the stone with his knuckles, listening to the sound it gave back. When their eyes turned toward the tower, no one moved. The door loomed dark against the wall. It bore scratches at its base, where fathers had once tried to force it open. Iron bolts crossed its surface. A heavy lock sealed it. The leader of the visitors, a gaunt man with gray streaks in his hair, laid a hand against the wood. He pressed, but the door did not yield. Dubrati. He listened, but no sound came. Behind him, the villagers shifted uneasily. Some crossed themselves, others looked down at their feet. Finally, the questions began. Had the bell tolled without hands?
Had it called the children? Had the curate collapsed at the altar? The villagers exchanged glances. No one wished to answer first. At last, a mother stepped forward. Her face was drawn, her shawl pulled tight against her neck. She spoke softly, her voice almost lost in the echoing nave. Her daughter, she said, had been taken. The girl had risen from her bed in the night, eyes open, lips moving, in words she could not understand. The mother had followed her into the snow. She had seen the prince herself, small and bare, leading straight to the tower door. But there they ended. No return, no sign, no child. The men from Rome wrote notes on parchment. They did not raise their eyes. A father came next. His son had been taken the same way. He told them of hearing a sound, so low he thought. At first it was the beating of his own heart, but it grew louder as his boy walked. And when the child reached the tower, he turned his head and smiled before vanishing into nothing. The father's hands trembled as he spoke, his eyes wet with tears. The visitors did not comfort him. They only asked, "Did you see the bell move?" The man shook his head. No, he had seen nothing. The curate was brought next, pale, thin, with eyes that never seemed to settle. His lips moved as though he whispered to himself, though no sound left his mouth. He wrote answers with shaking hands, the script jagged and uneven. When they asked what he had heard, he wrote a single word, heard. When they asked what he had seen, he drew a face, twisted, mouth open in silent scream, eyes black with ink. The parchment was taken from him quickly, folded and placed into a book. The visitors whispered among themselves. One shook his head, another said quietly, "Delirium." The curate lowered his eyes and said nothing more. For days the investigators remained in the village. They slept in the priest's chambers, their meals brought by silent parishioners. They spoke little to the villagers, but much among themselves, their voices low behind closed doors. And still, the people waited. They waited for what they knew would come, because the bell had always chosen its own moments, and it had never failed to speak. When strangers were near, at last, the investigators demanded to see it. The door was unbarred, the iron bolts pulled loose. The villagers gathered outside, some clutching rosaries, others holding their children close. The visitors entered first, their lanterns swinging, their shadows tall against the walls. Inside the tower, the air was cold, damp with stone. The bell loomed above them, suspended on its beams, iron dark and heavy. Its surface bore strange discolorations, streaks that no one could name. Its clapper hung still. The men circled it. They tapped it with rods of iron. They pressed their ears to it. One even placed his palm upon the cold metal, closing his eyes in concentration. Nothing. The villagers waited outside, holding their breath. The hours passed. The sun shifted in the sky. Lanterns burned low, then were refilled. Still, nothing moved. The investigators ordered prayers. They commanded hymns. The villagers sang, though their voices faltered. The sound of their own words echoed back hollow from the stone. Still, the bell remained silent, but something wasn't right. The silence was too complete, not natural. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something holding it down, as though the air itself had been bound, pressed into obedience. The villagers felt it in their chests, in the way their breath caught and did not release. Even the children, restless in their mother's arms, grew still, and that's when they realized. The bell was waiting. It had chosen silence, not because it was powerless, but because it would not show itself to Rome. The investigators left the tower at dusk. Their faces betrayed nothing. They closed their books, sealed their notes, and spoke only among themselves. The following morning, their judgment was given. The bell, they declared, was not cursed. It was not haunted. It was not the work of demons, nor of heresy. It was, in their words, an instrument of iron, and nothing more. But it must never be rung again. Not for mass, not for weddings, not for funerals, not for any reason. The villagers stared at them, uncomprehending. If it was harmless, why forbid it? If it was holy, why silence it? The visitors did not explain. They mounted their horses. They left without blessing, without farewell. Their black figures receded down the road, swallowed by the trees and the mist, and the village remained. The tower loomed as it always had. The bell hung silent, but the silence was no comfort. It was heavier now, more deliberate. The people no longer trusted their priest. They no longer trusted Rome. And when night fell, they no longer trusted their own homes, their own walls, their own silence, because silence had become a kind of sound, a waiting, a pressure, a promise. Mothers clutched their children closer. Fathers sat awake through the night, staring at the tower, and when they laid their heads to rest, some swore they could still feel it. Not a toll, not a voice, but a vibration under the skin, a hum that lingered at the edge of hearing, patient, enduring. Rome had ordered their silence, but the bell had ordered its own, and the people understood. This was not an end. This was a beginning. The night air drifts heavy through the valley. The tower stands dark against the horizon. Its windows hollow, its stone scarred by centuries of weather. Grass grows uneven at its base, pushing through cracked stone, as though nature has tried again and again to bury it, yet failed, but still it waits. The bell no longer swings. It has been chained for generations, the iron links drawn so tightly that its clapper cannot move. Every bolt rusted, every bar locked in place. It should be nothing more than a relic, a weight of iron, a husk of history. And yet, on some nights, long after midnight, the people of the village wake in silence, not because of what they hear, but because of what they cannot explain. The faintest toll, so soft it could almost be mistaken for memory, a vibration that seems to come not from outside, but from within the chest. One villager described it as a dream. He said he rose from bed and walked to his door, convinced the church bells had been rung for mass. But when he opened the door, the village was still. The air was thick, no sound carried except his own breath. Still he swore he had heard it. One low strike,
stretched thin through the night, a strike that seemed to reach him, not with sound, but with weight, like the touch of stone against bone. Others told of similar nights, a single toll, sometimes two, never more. Each time no one else in the house stirred, no one else admitted to hearing it. And yet they described the same feeling, a taste of iron, a dryness at the tongue, a ringing in the head that left them dizzy by morning. But something wasn't right, because it wasn't only the villagers anymore. Travelers who passed through the valley began to speak of it. Merchants, scholars, even pilgrims on their way to other towns. They described waking in the night, hearts racing, their mouths dry, as if they had been breathing dust. One man, a historian from Prague, wrote in his diary that he awoke in the inn with the sensation of grit on his teeth. When he spat into his hand, he found specks of rust-colored powder clinging to his tongue. He rinsed, he drank water, but the taste lingered for days. And that's when he heard it. Not outside, not in the air, but from within the stone walls of the inn itself. A low hum, deep in the timbers, as if the wood had remembered a sound no longer there. The villagers warned him not to speak of it. They told him the bell had been chained for centuries, that Rome had ordered it sealed, untouched, that nothing could move it. But the historian was not convinced. He stayed longer than intended. He walked the paths at night, circling the churchyard, waiting. He slept lightly, with his journal always at his side. On the third night, he dreamt. He dreamt of faces, twisted and indistinct, eyes that widened but did not blink, mouths that opened without sound. When he woke, the images did not fade. They clung to him, as though they had been burned behind his eyelids. He wrote that the dream carried a rhythm, a slow, steady beat, like metal against stone, like something that wanted to be remembered. And in the morning, he found dust again, this time heavier, this time black, his pillow stained with it, his throat raw as if he had swallowed smoke. Still the bell hung motionless, its chains held, its clapper bound. The villagers swore it could not be. But the sound spread. Families began to report strange dreams. A girl saw herself walking into the tower, though she had never set foot there. A farmer described the feeling of cold hands pressing against his chest as he lay in bed. Another claimed he saw sparks of light above the tower when the moon was full, though no others believed him. The priests tried to soothe the people. They said dreams meant nothing. They said dust was dust, and the air was old, and iron rusted in damp stone. But even they began to falter, because the bell was changing. On clear nights, when the sky was open, villagers swore they could see a sheen along its surface, not the dullness of age, but something wet, something that caught the moon. And when they dared to step close, they felt heat, not warmth from sun or flame, but the faintest warmth from within, a weight in the air, a heaviness in the stone. Something was shifting. Historians who came to study it wrote more cautiously. They measured the chains. They noted the cracks along the beams. They said the tolls were not real, that the sound must be imagination, carried by wind, by memory, by fear. But their notes betrayed something else. Margins filled with sketches of distorted faces, pages torn from journals, as if the writers had thought better of their own words. And when they left the valley, many did not return to their studies at all. The villagers knew better.
They could feel it in their sleep. They could taste it in their mouths. They knew the silence was not silence. It was waiting, and each night, the waiting grew heavier. One boy swore he saw the chains move, only slightly, only for a breath, but he swore they strained, as if pulled from within. His father struck him for lying, but the boy never entered the church again. Others whispered that the bell had already rung again, that it did not need sound, that it could toll within the body, within the mind, that it had never truly stopped. And so, in the stillness of the valley, beneath the shadow of its tower, fear settled deeper than faith, because the chains were not enough, the silence was not enough, and the waiting was nearly over. Snow fell that winter, like it had not fallen in years, thick, unrelenting, a weight that pressed on every roof, every tree, every body. The village seemed smaller beneath it, smothered under white silence. The streets narrowed, the houses leaned, smoke from chimneys curled only to vanish into the blinding haze. But the tower still rose above it all, dark against the pale, its stones slick with frost, its peak blurred by the storm. Inside, the bell hung unmoving, chained still, bound still, its iron blackened with centuries of rust. It should have been harmless. It should have been still. And yet the villagers spoke of sounds again. They said the storm was not only snow, that when the wind cut through the valley, it carried with it a tone, deep and thin, like iron struck from far away, not loud, never loud, but always enough to feel. The priest assured them it was nothing, that storms bent wood, that wind sang through cracks, that imagination thrived in darkness. But some saw the way he avoided the tower, how he crossed himself more often when the wind rose, how he prayed longer, his lips trembling. One evening, as dusk fell through heavy snow, a farmer swore he saw light in the belfry, a flash, pale and short-lived, like steel catching flame. He did not speak of it until later, until it was too late. The storm worsened, snow became ice, wind tore shingles from roofs, and still the tower held. But something wasn't right. On the 12th night of the storm, the ground shook, a crack rolled through the valley, sharp enough to rattle windows, to bring down clumps of snow from rooftops. The villagers froze. Some thought it was thunder, others swore it was something heavier. And then, it came. The tower moved, its spine of stone, brittle from age, bent beneath the weight. The villagers ran into the streets, clutching shawls, lanterns flickering. They looked up. The sky was black, the tower swayed, and from within, a single groan, long and tortured, escaped the iron chains. The first stones fell, a sound like teeth breaking. The villagers screamed, children clung to their mothers. The wind howled, and then the tower toppled. It did not crumble slowly. It broke in one great collapse, stone tearing through snow, timbers snapping, dust rising with the storm. And in that instant, the bell struck the earth. The sound tore through the valley. It was not the faint toll they had whispered of before. It was not a dream. It was not a memory. It was thunder in iron, a single strike that filled the chest, cracked the ears, shook the breath from every body. It rolled through bone. It carried through marrow. Witnesses swore it was not sound at all, but pressure, a weight that pinned them where they stood, that forced the air from their lungs, that made their eyes water, their knees buckle. And in the same moment, every candle in the village extinguished. All at once, flames bent, shrank, and died. Light collapsed. Darkness swallowed every room, every hall, every chapel, even the lanterns outside, gone in a breath. Only the snow remained, black sky above, white storm below, and the echo, the endless echo of that toll. No one moved, no one spoke. For some, the ringing never ended. For others, silence pressed harder than the sound had. When the wind eased, when the storm thinned, the tower was gone. Only rubble remained, stones scattered in snow, the bell itself half buried in the earth. But something wasn't right. The villagers approached, slowly, fearfully,
lanterns relit with shaking hands. The bell lay tilted, chains broken, its rim cracked but whole, and they swore, though no one dared touch it. It was warm. Some said steam rose faintly from its surface, though the air was freezing. Others said it pulsed, that if you stood too near, you could feel a rhythm, like a heart. One woman collapsed. Her child screamed that she had fainted at the sound, though no one else heard anything. She woke hours later, pale, lips trembling, unable to speak more than a whisper. But the village had changed. That night, no dog barked, no cock crowed at dawn. Even the birds seemed to vanish from the trees. The air carried a new silence, not empty, not peaceful, but heavy, as if the toll still lingered, as if the valley itself had been struck, and everything within it still trembled. Some villagers refused to enter their homes. They camped by fires in the fields, staring toward the ruins, unable to look away. Others locked themselves inside, doors barred, candles left unlit. They said light no longer felt safe, that shadows felt closer now, hungrier. And the priest stopped speaking altogether. He locked himself in the rectory, shutters drawn, refusing to leave. Those who pressed their ears to the door swore they heard him muttering, not prayers, not Latin, but something else, something broken. The collapse had ended the tower, but not the fear, not the toll, not the silence, because nothing was the same. The children woke at night, sweating, whispering words they did not know. Old men forgot their own names. Families found dust in their beds, fine and metallic, staining their lips, their teeth, and still the bell lay in the snow, tilted, cracked, waiting. Its sound was gone, but its silence was louder than ever, and the village understood what Rome had feared, what their ancestors had tried to chain, what they had tried to bury in stone. They understood, now, that you cannot silence what was never sound, you cannot bind what was never alive. And when the storm cleared, when the sun finally struck the valley again, the villagers looked upon the ruins of their tower, and none dared to speak, because all of them felt it, all of them knew. The final toll had already rung, and nothing could unring it. The field is quiet now. Grass pushes through the fractured stones. Where a tower once stood, the air carries the stillness of something long buried, yet never forgotten. And in the center of the field, half swallowed by soil and moss, lies what remains of the bell. The iron is blackened, split down one side, its mouth buried in the earth, as though the land itself tried to consume it. To most, it is nothing more than a ruin, a relic of time. But for those who live here, the bell has never stopped speaking. Travelers who come near describe an immediate weight pressing on the chest, the sense that their own heartbeat grows slower, heavier, until it seems to match a rhythm they cannot name. Researchers brought instruments, cables, and notebooks. They logged temperatures, barometric pressure, magnetic interference, and almost every reading came back wrong. Compasses spun, needles trembled, and at certain points, devices cut out completely, as if something pulled the electricity into silence. But what unsettled them most were not the machines. It was the sound. Those who stood closest swore they heard a faint vibration inside their skull, not quite a tone, not quite a voice, a pressure that curled behind the ear, steady as breathing, waiting for them to notice.
One man, a physicist from Warsaw, walked around the ruin with his recorder in hand. He muttered observations, timing his steps, and then he stopped. He placed his palm against the cracked metal. Later, he could not recall why he had done it. All he remembered was the taste, iron, sharp, as though rust itself had flaked onto his tongue. but he hadn't opened his mouth, and his lips were dry. When he pulled his hand back, his skin was unmarked, and yet the taste stayed with him for hours. Others refused to touch it at all. The villagers warned them. They said the bell remembers whoever lays hands upon it, and memory, they whispered, is not always a safe thing. But curiosity is stronger than fear. Always, pilgrims still come. They kneel in the grass, whispering prayers to the cracked iron, as though it could listen, as though it might absolve them of something hidden. And sometimes, when the wind moves low, they swear it whispers back. One woman, anonymous in her account, claimed she heard her father's voice. He had been gone 20 years. She said it was not a memory. It was not imagination. She heard him say her name, but something wasn't right. She left the field in silence, and days later, her family reported that she had locked herself in her home, refusing to speak again. The church denies the bell exists. Officially, the record shows that it was melted down long ago. They call the ruin a trick of weather, a mound of ironstone, a simple rock mistaken for something more. But the villagers know better. They live in the shadow of its silence. They hear the faint tolls at night when fog rolls down from the hills. They find fine black dust along their window sills, coating the inside of their mouths when they wake. And they know, with a certainty that no document can erase, the bell is still here, and it is not finished. One evening, a boy no older than 10 was dared by his friends to climb the mound. He laughed as he went, scrambling over roots, hands catching on stone. When he reached the top, he crouched beside the half-buried rim. He leaned down, and that's when he heard it. Not a ring, not even a hum, but the wet rasp of a whisper, like something moving across iron from the inside. He froze. His laughter stopped. The others called to him, but he would not move. When they pulled him down, his face was pale, his lips trembling. He said nothing for hours, and when he finally spoke, his words were simple, almost childlike. Since then, no child has dared climb the ruin again. Researchers still arrive, sometimes unannounced, slipping into the field at dawn. They set up tripods. They drill shallow cores around his earth, and yet, every time, their findings are inconclusive. The data slips, the samples corrode. They leave with boxes of notes that never add up. But the look in their eyes tells another story. Unease, suspicion, the quiet recognition that something is shifting beneath the ground. The villagers say the crack in the bell grows wider each year, that the soil beneath it loosens as if something is pushing upward. They do not go near, not anymore. And so the ruin waits, silent, patient, its broken mouth buried in the earth, drawing breath no one wishes to name. Those who have touched it say the memory never leaves. The taste of rust, the feeling of something vast and unseen pressing against the edges of thought. It lingers, in the body, in the mind, and in the silence after. When night settles over the field, they find themselves listening, always listening, for the toll that no one wants to hear again, because they know, if it rings once more, nothing will remain the same. Objects carry the memory of violence. Faith can sanctify what should have been buried.